So what I'm going to talk about this evening is more what's our vision for the coming year and the coming couple of years. You know, when we look back at the last year, the impact of COVID on all of us as individuals, we're stuck in our houses, as societies and communities, all the things we can't do at the moment, and obviously the huge impact on our economy in Scotland, but also in the UK, and how we rebuild that. Now, the economy will not just come back by itself. We'll actually have to invest, we'll have to put in time, we'll have to put in energy. But that does give us the choice as to what it is we rebuild. We all know we have to have a different type of economy by 2030 if we're not going to eat the planet, and if our grandchildren and their grandchildren are not constantly going to be facing forest fires, droughts, floods, or coastal erosion. So we know what we need to do, but in actual fact, trying to change an economy while it's active is really difficult. It's like trying to modify a speeding train. But because the economy has been brought to a dead stop, we have that opportunity. And I think we have that vision in Scotland, that we don't want to go back to business as usual. We want to build forward to a greener, more sustainable economy. We want to tackle climate change. We want to do what we have to do by 2030 to have that more circular, greener, sustainable economy. But also to be fairer. One of the weaknesses in our economy, the low productivity, is driven by inequality. What we've seen is people at the bottom of the economic pyramid having less and less since the financial crash in 2008, while the richest 10% have almost doubled their wealth. And the problem is, much as you have these proponents of trickle-down economics, money simply doesn't trickle down. It goes into banks, it goes into shares, it goes into offshore tax havens. What's happening at the bottom of the economy is ordinary people have less money, and therefore they have less spending power in their local economies. Now, that different vision is simply not on offer if we stay in the UK. Rishi Sunak has already delivered the budget for the UK a few weeks ago. There was no green revolution in it. There was nothing of note in it. The NHS barely got a mention. Social care, those words didn't even cross his lips at all. All we got was an announcement of another decade of Tory austerity. So already he has signalled that in September, furlough will come to an end. The extra money that people have got in universal credit will be taken away. So in the middle of a huge surge in unemployment, we will actually again make the poorest people poorer. And as I say, they're the ones who actually spent money in local shops, on local high streets. And you only have to look around, whatever your local high street is, to see how empty it is, to see how many shops are not thriving. Now, of course, that's happening at the moment because of COVID, but that's been happening for a long time. And if we look back at the last 10 years, well, 12 years really of 11 years of Tory austerity, what we see is that the rise in poverty of pensioners, disabled, and particularly children, which has surged, didn't happen at the time of the crash. It happened with the first welfare cuts in 2012. It accelerated further after the welfare cuts of 2016. So what has been happening is absolutely taking that money out of the pockets of people who are at the bottom end of the economy scale. And those people would spend all of their money in local shops because they don't have a lot of money to buy stocks and shares or to put into a saving account. And that money works in the economy. It will end up in the pockets of somebody wealthy, but it would have spiraled round the economy multiple times before it got there. And that's why austerity didn't even work. All of Osborne's promises of basically balancing the books by 2015 didn't happen. And Sunak is about to repeat exactly the same mistake. And our vision is for something different. The Scottish Government have had to spend the last 10 years trying to mitigate the Tory austerity, paying people's bedroom tax, now the Scottish Child Payment, providing the Scottish Welfare Fund for crisis situations. That should not be our story, that all we do is take the harm from Westminster and then try to mitigate it. Our vision going forward is a totally different kind of recovery. So yes, being really radical about a green and sustainable recovery, but also a fairer recovery, so that we're including more people, so that instead of focusing on GDP, which actually includes the proceeds of crime, we're looking at a well-being economy, looking at how to benefit the physical, mental, social, economic and environmental well-being of every single person who lives here in Scotland. Now, what many people don't know is that Scotland was the founder of the Wellbeing Economy Governance Group with Iceland and New Zealand. They've now been joined by Wales and Finland, and Canada is considering joining them at the moment. The National Framework of Wellbeing Policies was set up 2 years ago. And all of us could list off the wellbeing policies we have, literally from the cradle to the grave. The baby box, the Best Start grants, the early years expansion, free tuition, free prescriptions, and free personal care for older citizens. This is us trying to look after everyone who lives here, regardless of their age. And at our conference in November, I was really pleased that a resolution I put in got passed, which was a Wellbeing of Current and Future Generations Act. And regardless of whether it has that name, I'm hoping that that will be in the manifesto, to make the well-being of citizens a statutory duty for all levels of government, from Holyrood to local government to all public bodies, SEPA, Transport Scotland, Education Scotland, whoever, that everyone, when they're making a decision, they should be thinking about, will this make our people healthier and happier, or will it be the opposite? And I often think, if you're a councillor, imagine you're thinking about redesigning your town centre. Well, what do we think about most? What gets the most attention? Well, at the moment, actually, it's probably cars, where they can drive and where they can park. And people go on endlessly about where cars can park, instead of actually focusing on people, where people can walk, where they can cycle, where they could stand and chat, where they could sit outside if it was a nice day, where they could meet other folk to strengthen their community. The things that would attract people onto their high street and to be active within their community. And that's what we want to see as a change. That's what wellbeing economics is about, is looking at people, trying to be fairer, trying to ensure that we're not having people left behind. And by including more people in the economy and making sure that money is more fairly shared, actually more equal economies are more successful. We can only do that if we have the full powers of independence. And that's what makes it urgent. When people are going, why are you talking about independence in the middle of a pandemic? Well, we're not planning a referendum in the middle of a pandemic. That's been utterly clear from every statement from the Scottish Government. But when this pandemic starts to end, we need that referendum as quickly as possible. We need to achieve those powers as soon as possible so that we can use them, not just to mitigate the poverty and the impact of poverty on our children, the thing that basically will blight their entire lives because they have a poor start in life. We want to make the system better in the first place so that people are paid more fairly for their work, that people have a better chance of accessing work, of getting training, of keeping a job, instead of having people at the top with obscene amounts of money that they simply can't live long enough to spend, and people at the bottom who've got nothing. That is how we would rebuild our economy. If everyone who lives here has got spending power to put into the economy, and particularly to put into their local economies. Now, this is the clear blue water when you're talking to people about Scotland's vision for the coming years and the UK's. This is the clear blue water between staying in the UK or being independent, because you need that full range of powers if you're going to make these radical changes. Whereas what we see ahead of us is the threat of the UK Internal Market Bill. We already see how they've taken control of farming and fishing. We see how the Internal Market Bill removes control over food and environmental standards from the Scottish Parliament, things we've controlled for over 2 decades. So lots of innovative policies that have been brought in by Scotland or the other devolved nations would not be possible if the UK government doesn't agree to them under the Internal Market Act. So banning single-use plastics, that won't be possible for Scotland. We can ban the production of them in Scotland, but if they're made in England, they'll have a right to be sold here. We won't be able to stop that. The introduction of the smoking ban, Scotland led the way on that. Minimum unit pricing of alcohol. Both of those now, they would have to ask permission from the UK government to make sure they were not challenged under the Internal Market Bill. And this is what we're going to lose, is the dynamism and inventiveness of all 3 devolved nations that have often set out a path that Westminster has followed several years later. And the problem for me is I see that there is a danger that our Parliament's going to end up completely hollowed out. The Internal Market Bill also gives UK ministers power over infrastructure. So we could face the ridiculous situation of having a tunnel built from just down the coast from me to Northern Ireland, costing the entire of the Scottish infrastructure budget, that is not supported either by our Transport Minister nor the Transport Minister in Northern Ireland, and has been shown not to have any economic impact. The problem between Great Britain and Northern Ireland isn't the ferries. It's the Brexit bureaucracy that's causing the difficulties. Nobody talked about a tunnel 20 years ago between Scotland and Northern Ireland. There isn't a need for one now. And I'm sure most of you know the difficulties of trying to build a tunnel across Beaufort's Dyke, which is not only deep, but full of old munitions. So this seems just a crazy plan. They're also talking about that they would have the power to make infrastructure and investment decisions around health, around education, around sport. Just be in no doubt, they are seeking to dismantle devolution. Now, there are many people in Scotland who, unlike us, do not support independence, but the vast majority of people support devolution and really support devolution. Now, it's crazy if you're trying to keep the UK together that you would remove that middle way, but that's what they're doing. And it's important that when we're talking to people, that we make sure that we talk about the power grab, that we talk about the Internal Market Act and what it could do. And what it could do to our NHS, in that suddenly now they have power to make changes in Scotland. If they're making a trade deal with America or anywhere else, they will be able to put the terms of that trade deal will apply to Scotland as well. It's already there that if something is imported under the Internal Market Act, it has to be accepted anywhere in the UK. So suddenly our differentiation is being undermined. And it is important that people understand that. And it's important that all of you take the trouble to explain that to people, to reach out and talk to them about it. And this is what makes independence urgent. In 2014, I campaigned all over Scotland. My husband Hans and I, we did over 5,000 miles in 2014, doing talks like this, though in reality and in the real world. And that was because I believed Scotland could be so much better than it is. I think Scotland has huge potential, but we were being held back. I now think independence is urgent because I fear Scotland could become so much worse. We could end up that we are simply under direct rule, a backwater in Brexit Britain. And we need to reach out to the people who voted no in 2014. And we need to do that gently and with respect. We need to listen to why they voted no. There will be all sorts of people who had concerns that we failed to reassure, and we have to accept the responsibility for that. So for all of us, even if we're not able to have big public meetings, we should be reaching out to friends, to neighbours, to family, to work colleagues, and trying to have these conversations. Not like this in a, 20 minutes, half an hour, loading them with everything, but dropping one pebble. Think about something that is really important to them and just drop that one pebble. Is it about an opportunity that their children have to attend university without paying over £9,000 a year? Or is one of their children a student nurse that we invest 20 grand a year in between the tuition fees and the nursing bursary? Or is it that their mother is getting free personal care and is able to stay in their own home? So it's having these conversations and trying to explain that some of these benefits only exist in Scotland. None of the other nations provide free personal care. How long will we be able to defend these policies if we're gradually pulled back to decision-making happening in Westminster? So it's really important that we do that, but that we do it gently. There were many people who were lied to, who believed the lies, believed Project Fear, or believed the promises. Two of the biggest promises we had was vote no to stay in the EU. Many of you will know European citizens who voted no because they thought that was safer. The vast majority of them now would vote yes if we have another referendum. And the other promise was that Scotland was an equal partner in a family of nations. Well, the last 5 years have proven that to be a complete crock. If you watch Parliament TV at any time, you will see how the majority of MPs that are sent by Scotland to Westminster are treated with contempt. You will also see how the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament are treated with contempt. Scottish Government were the first to put forward a compromise around Brexit in the report Scotland's Place in Europe, when we called for Scotland and Northern Ireland to have a special relationship with Europe that not only would help deal with the Irish border, but would respect how both of those nations voted. That was chucked out after about 8 weeks. They weren't interested, and they weren't interested in compromise. They've not cared that the Scottish Parliament has withheld legislative consent for so many aspects of Brexit legislation. They simply don't care. And whenever they pay any attention to Scotland, it's negative attention. And that's what we would face in the future. So we need to get people to understand the choices that we face now and how they're different from 2014. In 2014, people who weren't sure voted for the status quo. The status quo looked like the big, smooth, brightly lit motorway straight ahead. I know what that is, I'm just going to stick with that. Independence was like turning off onto a country road, no lights, lots of trees, not quite sure what's down here. I don't think I'm ready to vote for that. And that was a comment that many of us heard. I'm not ready to make that decision. Well, right now there is no status quo. It's a fork in the road. And down one of them is Brexit Britain and us being walled in here. They talk about global Britain, but with the cuts to international aid, with the changes they're making regarding asylum seekers, basically the UK has no intentions of playing a positive role in the world. It's all going to be about the UK first. They're very much following Trump's roadmap from the point of view of America first. That's what we have in our Britain Trump, as he called them. Our vision is that we take our place in the world, that we play our part, that we are part of the EU, that we sit at the table and make decisions as equals with other countries, but that we also step up to our responsibilities regarding global poverty, regarding well-being for people across the globe, regarding tackling climate change. And that's what we want to see. And it is that simple fork in the road. If we get stuck in the UK, we are basically locked in the boot of Boris Johnson's car. And it's either that or we climb into the driving seat and we start making our own choices and following our own path. Now, it won't be easy. You know, I was very clear in 2014, there isn't an independence fairy. It will not be that everything is suddenly sparkly and covered in glitter and everything changes overnight. But suddenly we would have the powers at our hands to build a better nation, to build a fairer nation. And that's something for us to be the generation that could do that, to build a better country that we would leave to our children and grandchildren. I think that is something that all of us could be proud of for the rest of our lives. And we need to make sure that we get the opportunity to choose that. And that starts with the election on the 6th of May. So we need to, it's going to be a difficult campaign because it's not going to be like any campaign any of us have ever fought. Our advantage of boots on the ground is undermined because we can't have so many boots on the ground. But whatever it is you can do, you need to get out and do it. And you need to also be ready for the fact that it will then simply move on into being an independence campaign. We need to be working from now forward to win the election, to get the referendum, but then to win the referendum. And finally, when we do that, that's when the real work starts. That's when we have to get up off our backsides, stop whinging and moaning, roll up our sleeves and get to work. But as I say, I think the opportunity to do that, I think that's something all of us would grab with both hands. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Philippa, for that. I think that's very inspiring, and it gives us something to work for in the coming election. Now, if anyone wants to ask questions at all, put them on the chat, and we'll put them to Philippa and see where we go. There's one question there from Ross Lowe. Do we think that the questions from 2014 are being answered? Currency, the pension lie, etc.
Well, there are people working on them. There's a project, I think it's part of the Scottish Independence Convention, called the Transition Group. Obviously, Commonweal are writing lots of options. But yes, there are people like Richard Murphy on tax, Tim Rideout and others. So there are people who are working on those things. Obviously, in the end of the day, the final offering around these will come from the Scottish Government, but there are a lot of people who have expertise who are bringing a lot of that together. The currency has always been, frankly, a complete straw man. You know, many of you'll know I'm from Belfast. Well, you know, growing up in Belfast, bigger shops took the pound, but they also took the punt. And when Ireland was changing to the euro, they took the pound, the punt, and the euro. And frankly, most of us pay either with contactless or a phone. So, you know, what currency do you want to pay in? I mean, really, currency is such an irrelevance at the moment. And if you go back to the Macron report, obviously, when he talked about the oil, his concern was that actually a Scottish currency underpinned by oil would be in danger of being too strong a currency and making exports too expensive. Now, okay, oil is nearing the end of its life, not because we're running out, but because we're going to have to leave some of it in the ground. But Scotland has 25% of Europe's marine energy potential. So we have another energy boom coming, both in direct generation of electricity, but also particularly in hydrogen production, which is going to be the next liquid fuel or mobile fuel, if you like. And we can't afford that all is squandered in the same way as the oil was. So we are incredibly wealthy in natural resources, and we need to be in control of that. And if you were in control of your own currency, which is the policy that we move to that as soon as practicable, in essence, then we could do the quantitative easing that the UK government is doing. They keep talking about the broad shoulders. Frankly, at the moment, they're just printing money. The Bank of England is just printing money for them. You know, other countries are able to do the same. If they have their own national bank, then they're able to do that. So to me, it's quite clear. You have a short period of sterlingization while you switch over, just as they did in Ireland, but not for anything like the length of time Ireland did. And then you have to get over to your own currency as soon as possible.
Okay, another question is from Willie Hone. Philippa, do you think that universal basic income could have a role to play in post-COVID economy recovery as part of a well-being economy in Scotland?
I certainly do. I mean, we kept putting that forward at the start of COVID, saying that there should actually be an emergency universal basic income. You know, if you think about, particularly through national insurance, because people pay national insurance at a much lower level than tax, the government had the financial details of the vast majority of working age adults in the UK. And they could have simply reversed the flow to make sure that everyone had an amount of money that they could survive on. Whereas we still have almost 3 million people, the excluded as they're called, who have fallen through the cracks, creatives, freelancers, etc., people who became self-employed relatively shortly before the pandemic. So, I mean, I think that universal basic income is a really important concept to look at. Whether it is exactly how you do it or whether it's a minimum income guarantee, there's different ways of doing it, and I think we should be exploring all of them. I'm sure you know that the Scottish Government were planning 4 pilots with 2 different approaches, one with a kind of benefit level of finance and the other one with actually closer to a livable level of finance. But the DWP wouldn't cooperate. It was just clear that if that money was given, everything else would be taken away, and therefore, yet again, like with the bedroom tax and everything else that we mitigate, we're just sending our budget back to Westminster. I mean, we're seeing that even with the Scottish Child Payment. When that's going to go to families where the universal credit uplift is taken away, in essence, the Scottish Child Payment is just disappearing back down the road to Westminster. So, you know, you need the absolutely to be an independent country so that you control the whole circle, so that all the money you invest, as I say, so universal basic income gets that money at the bottom of the economic pyramid. It gets spent, it stimulates shops, they employ more people, they spend money, and so on. The goods they sell are manufactured, that employs more money, and it spirals upwards. It generates tax, it generates a return. Our problem is that when we help businesses set up, when we give people the mitigations that we do, the return on that ends up in Westminster. A government needs a circle, that the money they spend in civil service pay, in public sector pay, or in benefits comes back to them in economic return. And unfortunately, it doesn't come back to us in economic return. So I absolutely think universal basic income has a place, but whether it's an actual universal basic income that everyone gets, even if they're rich, or whether it is something where you have an income guarantee below which nobody falls, I think the methodologies simply have to be explored. And at the moment, we're just not able to do that.
Okay, thank you. We have a question, well, a couple of questions from Heather Anderson. She's wanting to ask about the UK internal market and the end of the status quo, and also thoughts on Brexit and the Scottish accession back into the EU.
I'm not quite sure what Heather's question about the internal market is. I mean, obviously, the UK government created this term. There was never anything called the UK internal market. But the UK Internal Market Act, if you have a look at it, it's got a lot of powers within it. So the power over infrastructure, the power over investment, the power for direct spending in Scotland on key devolved issues. Now we already see through the Levelling Up Fund that they're cutting out the Scottish Parliament and government, and local government here will have to apply to Westminster for that funding. So, and equally, of course, any council is going to apply for any pot of money that's available. So they're using all the powers of that to cut out Holyrood in any way that they can. I mean, one of the things they had in was that people who are accepted as professionally qualified anywhere in the UK must be allowed to work everywhere in the UK. Now, there was a lot of pushback on that from the General Teaching Council in Scotland, because in England, you don't need a teaching qualification to be a teacher. If you have a degree in maths, you get a 6-week course and you can be a teacher. Here, you have your degree in maths, but you actually have to then go and get a postgraduate teaching qualification. Same in Wales. Now, they're having apprentice nurses. They are talking about even having apprentice doctors. They are using a lot more of healthcare assistants and physician associates, all sorts of, if you like, non-traditional grades of the professions. And some of them we don't have in Scotland, and we're not looking to have them in Scotland because we consider that these professions require for people to have that expertise. But if they use if you got a challenge in court under that, then these things will get pushed on us. And it's incredibly wide ranging. You know, it's not just about protecting Northern Ireland or anything else. It literally dismantles devolution. And that's why the Welsh government, despite being a pro-union government, are as against it as we are. From the point of view of getting back into Europe, I think there's huge sympathy for Scotland. I think among MEPs in the Parliament, there would be a huge welcome for us to return. But two things. One is we would have to apply. We are outside. And the sooner that we are independent and able to do that, then hopefully we would be less far from the EU. The further we get away from the EU, the longer Brexit continues, the danger is more of our standards or structures would have been undermined, and we would meet fewer and fewer of the EU regulations. At the moment, we meet all of the acquis, all of the EU regulations, but we would have to apply. That would take time, but often they would offer things like an association agreement where you start to get some of the benefits of the single market, even though you're not fully in. And if you look at the accession of other countries, often they're allowed to behave as if they are members in the areas of society or the economy where they already meet the standards. One thing we have to bear in mind, however, is that despite all of the fighting at the moment, the EU and Ireland, who are clearly an ally of ours, they are trying to find their new relationship with the UK. So people who think, oh, the more they fall out with the UK, that's great, that'll just make it easier for Scotland. That's not actually true, because I think that, you know, they will also have to be finding an equilibrium, finding a way of working with the UK government going forward. And so we need to be careful in our language. We are not asking Europe to choose between dealing with the UK government and accepting Scotland. We're not asking Ireland to choose. So we need to make sure that we're not putting it in that way. And I've heard people put it in that way, and that is not helpful. We will be good neighbours to England and Wales. And to be honest, going back to the point I made earlier about being equal partners in a family of nations, to me, the only way that will ever happen is as independent countries, where, to my mind, all 4 nations are independent and sovereign of each other and can choose to work together in areas of common interest, like I'm sure we would be doing now in the pandemic, like we would do around climate change, like we would do with Scotland saying we will provide the defence in the High North. But at the moment, it's not a partnership at all. It's simply a bullying relationship.
Okay, thanks very much, Philippa. I think that was a fairly in-depth answer. Heather, you wanted to unmute to explain that, or?
It was just quickly that there was a poll in the Courier today, Philippa, saying that it was 51 for remaining in the UK and 49 for independence, but it went up to 53% if people believed we would get back into the EU. So it was just to get any sense from you about behind the scenes work that the Westminster Group are doing on maintaining those relationships, and whether there's any chance of any positive reactions from the EU to our potential return, because it helps us with that.
Well, I think we've already had more and more outspoken MEPs in Europe who have been very positive about Scotland, and Terry Rinke is one, but there have been several who are very much speaking about wanting to see Scotland come back into Europe. The problem with that poll is that it seemed to be just very binary, as in, you know, if we had a guarantee we would get into Europe, or if we had no chance of getting into Europe. I think if Europe was saying you can never, ever, ever be a member, then people would start to be anxious about Scotland being isolationist, being on its own, being not connected to anybody. But Europe is never going to say that. I don't think there'll be any issue with Scotland getting in, but it'll be, you know, how quick and how easy can we get in? But equally, what we can't expect is that Europe will meddle in our independence referendum, that they will say things like, okay, if you vote for independence, we will guarantee you a place in 2 years' time or 1 year's time. That's not going to happen either. So I think we will get more welcoming words. As Europe spokesperson, I had expected to spend 2020 visiting European capitals, etc. I've taken part in quite a few meetings with European ambassadors and chef de mission in the embassies in London. I'm chair of the German All-Party Group, so I work quite hard on that as one of the key relationships, simply because I can speak German and I know Germany well because of Hans. And I'm trying to get my colleagues to all, if you like, adopt a country and put effort into developing those informal relationships with MPs in other European countries. And I think it's important that we do that, that Scotland is outspoken. Clearly, we're going to have a big stage in November with COP26. I was selected as a parliamentarian for peace last year, working with a total of 10 MPs from across the world, South Africa, in Taiwan, Canada, all over the place. And through that got invited to speak at a global forest summit hosted by Emmanuel Macron a couple of weeks ago. So, you know, I think any opportunity Scotland has to get on the world stage to talk about our vision, and particularly the Wellbeing Economy Governments Group, gives Scotland quite an unusual place to be speaking. And I think we need to do that towards Europe, but we need to also be doing it wider than that. But we're not going to get a promise in advance, nor there's no possibility that we would get a refusal in advance. So I didn't really think that poll was, I didn't feel either half of it was kind of close to reality. I think it'll be more, you would be very welcome, but of course you will have to apply.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Philippa. Moving on the international side, we've got Catherine Sinclair's asking, Philippa, can the Scottish Government use the UN Charter of Self-Determination against Westminster if they refuse to accept a vote of independence?
The view of Joanna Cherry and most other kind of constitutional lawyer types, which I have to say I'm not, is that we can't because we're not a colony in the traditional kind of meaning of the word. And that therefore it doesn't apply to us. Now, I'm sure that argument might be made if we end up in a court, and certainly Scotland's right to secede from the union, it's meant to be a voluntary union, etc. You know, there are lawyers who say that we would have the right to do that. It's never been tested legally, but my understanding was that the UN Charter was not something that would play a big part in it. But you know, what all they would throw into the mix if we end up in the Supreme Court, I mean, that's beyond me. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but when I've asked about it before, people who are in that kind of area of expertise tend to say that that's not something we can just fall back on. Okay,
thank you. And quite a detailed question from Ian and Lindsay. The pandemic has given the whole Scottish population a unique opportunity to see and identify with Holyrood as their parliament rather than Westminster. That has been a real and empowering eye-opener for many. It's our parliament, not theirs. Is there a case for our brightest and best SNP elected representatives to be based in Holyrood to continue that direction of travel?
Oh, of course. I'd much rather be in Holyrood, using my, nearly 40 years as a doctor to try and improve health, well-being and healthcare in Scotland than down in Westminster in a talking shop. There's no question. But unfortunately, I mean, I disagree with the NEC decision that clearly made it clear that MPs were not welcome to stand. But yeah, of course. And I think over time, that's where they should end up. It is our parliament. I think what the pandemic has particularly brought home to people is what is reserved and what's devolved. So people have seen our NHS work really well. Particularly in this second wave and the third surge, Scotland has had lower cases and fewer deaths than any of the other nations. My poor husband tracks it for me every day. Our home computer has a year's worth of COVID data on it. And literally at the peak in January, we had half the case rate of all other nations. They were all very similar. So the different management in Scotland, the greater success of that management has been obvious to people. But people have seen that we don't control our borders. We don't have the power to just say, you can't fly here. We also don't control the money. So when SAGE advised an urgent lockdown on the 21st of September last year, the First Minister spoke in Holyrood the following day and said we weren't allowed to visit each other indoors. And that has remained. So that's 6 months. And she said at that time, if I had financial powers, I would be going much further. But at that time, furlough was already being wound down. It was due to end the following month in October. And despite the Welsh, Northern Irish and Scottish governments begging Rishi Sunak, he refused to extend it. He only extended it when finally London had to go in to strict COVID measures. So people saw that in a way that people have never seen. I mean, as an MP, and I'm sure Callum remembers this from his time, you get letters and emails about everything because most people have no idea what's local government, what's Holyrood, what's Westminster. But I think this has made it much clearer to people what is reserved and what's devolved. And I hope and think, and it is something to discuss, is very much how that has held us back. Last summer, we reached elimination levels of COVID. We drove it right down. Scotland eliminated virtually all of the 300 COVID strains that had been running in the first wave. If we had had the power to shut our borders completely, we would have been able to open up our domestic economy completely, like Taiwan, like New Zealand, like Australia. Our schools would be open, we'd be down the pub, we'd be in restaurants, we'd be in cinemas. We wouldn't be traveling on holiday, but our domestic economy would be fully open. And 5,500 people who've died over this winter would still be with us. And 5,500 families wouldn't be grieving. But we didn't have that absolute power. And I think that has become obvious to people. So I think there are many opportunities to talk to people, whether it's the changes of Brexit, which have been catastrophic for Scottish industry, or whether it's the impact of the pandemic. There will be people who are rethinking, their judgment of the Parliament, the government, our party, and also what is it we want after this? We literally have been brought to a halt. We have an opportunity to think about what we want our lives and our communities to be like going forward. And I think all of that offers us the opportunity to discuss with people why we should become independent.
Okay, a question from Stuart. He's asking, Is Andrew Wilson's Sustainable Growth Commission, is that now dead or is it still ongoing?
Well, I can't say I was a big fan of it from the start. I think some of it was being quite realistic, and I think it is important. As I said, there isn't an independence fairy, and you know, even in 2014, I always talked about the hard work we'd have to go through, the efforts we would have to make, the fact that it would not change overnight, but suddenly we would have the tools in our hands to make things happen. So I think there were people who welcomed the growth report, but a lot of it, the being stuck with the pound for so long, is not something that I would want to see, nor the kind of City of London light aspects of it, you know, and I think certainly now, post-COVID, that's not what people are looking for. People are looking for radical change. So I think it will be, you know, how we, you know, get on with land reform, how we look at the change to renewable energy, how we invest in infrastructure, whether it's housing or greener transport, etc. I mean, people have to remember, Scotland has 34% of the UK's resources. We are half the size of England. We are not small. And yet we only share that among kind of 8.4% of the UK population. So in resource per head of population, whether it's our marine area, our energy, our land use, etc., we have enormous resources. And to be honest, going forward, it will be things like land, water, and energy that will define whether a country is rich or not. And Scotland is rich in those terms. So I think that people are not looking to go back to business as usual. And I think Andrew's report was a little bit too much like that. Oh, we're independent, but kind of we're the same. And, you know, I certainly was disappointed. And I know that, you know, many SNP members and Yes supporters were disappointed. And I think what we've been through in the last year definitely changes it.
Okay, a question from Grace Murray. She's saying that she recently retired from Scottish Enterprise and wonders how the Internal Market Bill will affect our economic development agencies, given that they have strategies and plans to support national and local priorities.
Well, the problem is that it undermines that. I mean, both the Levelling Up Fund, as it's called, and what's called the Shared Prosperity Fund, which we've been given no further information on. This is the thing that supposedly will replace EU funding. But again, it's clear that the UK government are wanting to try to cut Holyrood and therefore, by default, the enterprise structures out of that, and basically be dealing with local government, and that Westminster will decide what are our priorities. To get an idea of what we're looking at, if you have a look at the new reports on the kind of union transport connectivity, the chair is from Transport for London, and I think it was 5 members of the board. They're all London based. 4 out of the 5 have worked for Transport for London at some point. I think one of them is Scottish, although he's now kind of in London. Someone said he's the person who was involved in the Edinburgh trams, which is not a great advert. But there was no consultation with the Scottish government or indeed the other devolved governments. And if you look at what's in it, it is still all about London's view. So you're talking about a team in London making a decision as what transport investment is needed to connect Scotland. And what they were talking about, virtually the only piece of infrastructure they were talking about was improving the A75. And that's much more about getting to Stranraer to connect to Northern Ireland. It's not something that's going to be massively transformative for Scotland itself. It'll have a local impact, but it will not have a Scotland-wide impact. And so I really fear that both the Parliament and government's priorities will be cut out, and ergo the enterprise structures will be cut out as well.
Okay, question from Donald. He's saying, you mentioned well-being. Many folk feel that patronage and privilege lead to inequalities and impact on well-being. How do we reduce or eliminate patronage and privilege?
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, that all comes back to greater equality and fairness. You know, if you look at the impact of child poverty, which is horrific, and the increase in child poverty, that actually will mark that child not for a few years in their childhood, but actually through their whole lives. They will struggle at school because they're hungry or they're cold or their parents are fighting all the time over every single pound coin. And patronage and privilege is part of that. The UK is an incredible structure, you know, from the royal family into aristocracy, into a wealthy elite. And that elite, you know, in the last 10 years of austerity, the richest 10%, so it's not all aristocratic, some of it is just wealth, the wealthy elite who have power, they have almost doubled their wealth, while the people at the bottom have become poorer. So the inequality in the UK financially has widened, and it is interlaced with the kind of old power of kind of aristocracy and, you know, landed gentry or whatever you want to call it. But also, if you like, the newer power, the political power, the celebrity power, and the people who are behind politics and have money. And unfortunately, that's an international business. And if you start following that, it becomes very frightening, whether it's connections to Russia, connections to America. There are people with immense wealth who are able to influence the politics in the UK in quite a frightening way. And so while when we think of patronage, we may be tending to think of the House of Lords, the hereditary peers that still exist, but also it's just things like land ownership. It's just the way that holds us back. And these are things that will all have to be tackled and all have to be thought of. But equally, we have the opportunity to do that. And it's one of the reasons why I often think people should engage with the various constitution projects now. I don't think a constitution is something you wait until you're independent. I think you should be engaging with the projects, you know, Clyde built constitution or Constitution for Scotland, and engaging with the thoughts now. Because actually, for some people, that's actually quite inspiring to get rid of some of the anachronisms that we have in the UK around power and privilege. So I think people should put a little bit more thought into that constitution for an independent Scotland. What would be our rights as citizens? What would be our responsibilities as citizens? Because I think that conversation for some people is quite inspiring, because it's a whole new blank page, but you have to think about what you're going to write on it.
Liz Johnson's asking, what are the top 3 campaign issues for persuading no voters in May's election?
I think that the COVID recovery, I think the recognition of the need for a well-being recovery, a kind of greener tackling climate change. I think that whole COVID recovery is quite important. I think the NHS and social care is really important, because they have played such an important role, and the impact of them if we continue where we are. So what we've done well, but equally the challenges that we'll have ahead, because there's an enormous backlog and it's the same staff. So, you know, the NHS is going to have a really difficult time over the next couple of years. And I think the third one is devolution, and unpeeling and unpacking and finding simple, clear language to explain what the Internal Market Act does, to explain how the devolution we have come to take for granted over the last 2 decades is being unwound. So those to me are major ones. I think what also runs for many people will be Brexit. And I think Brexit at the moment is being swept under the COVID carpet. Everything is being blamed on the pandemic. And I think there will be a lot of small print impacts of Brexit that will only actually become clear as we start to come out of the pandemic. So those 4 would be my kind of top topics, if you like, that I think that people will want to talk about.
Yeah, okay. Ross was asking, can he ask about the social care thresholds? At the moment, they are £18,000 to £28,000, and that would seem that it penalises those that have worked hard and saved all their lives. Would an independent Scotland look to abolish those thresholds? It appears that at present, your free National Health Service ends when you need it most.
Well, I think social care is one of the areas where we have both the potential and the challenge to do a lot of work. As you know, the Scottish Government are considering a national care service. Now, initially, that will not be the same as the National Health Service because, of course, it's much more disparate, it's much more fragmented, and a lot of it is delivered by individual private companies. But starting from having national contracts, national service standards, terms and conditions, training, clinical outcomes, etc., so that you're gradually pulling it together. I think as we go forward, there will start to be more of, instead of outsourcing social care, we will start in many areas to see social care going forward actually being taken back in to kind of public delivery. I think what is different between the NHS and social care is there is talk out of the Feely report. I don't know if you've had a look at it, but it's really excellent, the independent review that's been done over the winter. And it talks about having a change in narrative. So seeing social care as an investment in allowing people to be independent, allowing people to participate in society rather than as a burden. And one of the proposals is that all of the non-accommodation services should be free in the same way as your healthcare would be. And I think that that is something that will be accepted. One of the differences is you don't live in hospital for 5 years generally. And therefore, I think there will remain a component of payment within residential social care. But in actual fact, more than 2/3 of people have social care at home. And therefore, if you were expanding free services for people at home, they wouldn't be paying that. You then can start to look at how cheaply can you provide accommodation, how reasonable can you make it, where do you put the threshold? But I think what's already in train is moving to that more standardized national care service, making all of the services free and allowing more people to stay at home for as long as possible. And I think that would improve what we're offering people. But I don't think we're going to get to a point where if you're spending 8 years living in a residential home, that you're not paying anything, because you would have accommodation costs if you were still in your own home. But how we handle that, I still think that the majority of social care should be tax. I think an insurance system, which is one of the threats of the UK, that they are planning a green paper later in the year. And my concern is that they may try to propose, like the German or Japanese method, which is in essence social insurance. But in both of those systems, the co-payments are increasing because there is a shortfall. Whereas in actual fact, it's, less than 20% of people will be in a care home. If you share that among all taxpayers, it becomes affordable. If you put all of the cost on that small group, it's quite expensive. So if you're wanting to reduce those accommodation costs, we then have to look at how we pay for them. And one of the simple things that I think is, why do we stop paying national insurance when we retire? So in actual fact, just exactly when we're going to use health and social care at its highest level, we may spend 30 years not contributing to it at all. So to me, you would set it so that if you're only on the state pension, you don't pay anything. But for pensioners who are comfortably off, they might continue paying national insurance. Or you just get rid of national insurance, because it is in essence tax. It's just called something different. So you might actually just say, well, we'll ditch national insurance. We will have a guaranteed pension anyway, and this is our tax rate, and what level do we have to set our tax so that we can provide good healthcare and good social care to everyone. And then that automatically affects pensioners who are wealthy because they pay tax, but they don't pay national insurance. So one of the issues is that anachronism around national insurance. But you have to look at how we would generate that money. And to me, the solidarity of all of us pooling our resources and supporting those who need it is still a better principle than us taking out various forms of insurances that actually just end up making profits for companies. And if that company goes bust just when you need it, suddenly you don't have the cover you've been paying for 30 years.
Okay, another one on international relations. It's from Stuart. He's asking, to what extent is Scotland building a relationship as a future member of the Nordic Council and Northern cultural neighbours?
Well, Finland is one of the members now of the Wellbeing Economy Governance Group. So, you know, they meet and they share ideas around that kind of well-being economy approach. The First Minister has attended the Nordic Council and High Arctic events in the past. A lot of my colleagues are engaging with the Faroes, with Iceland, with Norway, but also with the Baltic states. So there's actually quite a lot of outreach from the Westminster Group towards the Nordic and Baltic countries. They tend to be smaller countries. They have very high social standards, which we aspire to. They're very strong on equality. And if you look at some of the Baltic states like Estonia, they're very innovative around using, the digital world to strengthen their country. So we actually do quite a lot of outreach in that direction. And certainly I think that the feeling there would very much be that Scotland would be a kind of fairly natural member of the kind of Nordic relationships. And particularly from the defence point of view, you know, the North Channel, because of the melting of the Greenland ice, is going to become a stronger trade route for Russia. At the moment, we have very little protection. I'm sure all of you know that the nearest surface ship is on the south coast of England. So, you know, using satellite, low Earth observation satellites, using drones, using fast surface ships, etc., a Scottish Defence Force could actually contribute in a significant way to monitoring our own marine area, which stretches away out into the Atlantic, but also sharing the role of both observing and defending the High North.
Okay, as a question and a bit of a statement really from Callum. He's saying the Tory strategy is becoming increasingly Trumpian. Forget the moral high ground. Try and drag everyone else down to your level, even if that means truth sometimes becomes a stranger and it damages confidence and respect for our institutions and our politics. How do we tackle this? As it is only going to get worse as they are increasingly desperate.
It is going to only get worse, but I think actually us staying on the high moral ground is quite important. I think it's always important to get supporters, whether they're SNP or Yes, to understand that often when we as MPs are speaking in Parliament or when we're speaking in social media, we're speaking to no voters. We're trying to reach out and highlight what is happening, whether it's the Internal Market Act or Brexit or the lies, the cronyism, the corrupt contracts at Westminster, all of these things. We are trying to highlight that to the people who voted no in the past and maybe have not yet changed their minds. We therefore have to maintain quite a kind of calm, sensible form of language. If we descend to their level, to be honest, we just look like, toddlers in a play pit or, people in a pub brawl. I don't think that converts anybody. But there is no question that they're getting more and more desperate. I mean, Oliver Dowden's new they're not regulations, but the new guidance, as they say, that the Union flag has to fly from all public buildings every single day of the year, etc. I mean, frankly, if they think that's going to create a happy, jolly union, then they're even more deluded than I thought they were. But I think it's important that we, as they say, when your enemy is digging a big hole, don't stop them. So I think we let them get on like that. And it's important that there is a contrast. So that contrast that we saw between how the First Minister has dealt with COVID, how she has spoken to the Scottish people at all of the daily COVID briefings, straight into the camera, clear English, being honest when things are difficult, that is really important. And how that contrasts with Boris Johnson, who simply is unable to give bad news, who always has to make promises he can't keep, who always has to claim that everything is world leading. The contrast is really, really dramatic. And all of us need to follow that same contrast so that our behavior on social media is polite, is respectful. If you're having a stand-up fight with someone on Twitter, you're not going to convert them, but there will be other no voters who watch how you speak to them and think that's how you would talk to them as well. So the problem is you're scattering ammunition so widely that you're harming people who might have been interested in what you had to say. So all of the kind of calling people yuns and you yes yet and all of that kind of negative attack on people doesn't convert anyone. If you remember back to childhood, the fable of, the wind and the sun and the snow trying to get the man to take his coat off. It was the sun that got him to take his coat off. You will convert more people by kindness, by respect, by reaching out, by listening to them, by talking to them respectfully, than having a stand-up rammy on a street stall or on social media, wherever it is. So I think we let Boris Johnson go on with his very desperate attempt to think that just plastering everything in the Union flag is going to make all of us go, oh, okay then, that is so pretty, I've decided I don't believe in independence anymore. I don't think that's likely for me, and I don't think that's likely for most people in Scotland.
Great, okay. Yeah. Next question is on housing from Yvonne. Despite the investment in new housing, homelessness remains a significant issue across Scotland. Are there any radical proposals that we can look forward to in the manifesto to address this?
Well, I haven't seen the manifesto. Obviously, I've put forward my kind of health and well-being type of proposals, but I don't get a look at it before it comes out, so I have no idea. But obviously, the kind of housing first proposal, which I have a vague feeling comes from Finland, is one of the well-being economy approaches, which is the idea of, instead of just constantly putting people into night shelters, you actually try to get them into a permanent house or flat, and you put in services to try and help them stay there. Of course, that requires housing. Now, Scotland has built proportionally way more social and affordable housing than anywhere else in the UK over the last decade, but clearly that was held back in the last year and needs to accelerate. But we also need to be looking at the kind of housing that we're building and where we're building that housing. So building vast housing estates with no services, no GP, no shop, no school, that are just kind of like dormitories in blocks. We need to not go down that sort of road again. So it's got to be building communities. And I think that recognition is there, that we need to accelerate, but we need to be building almost zero energy houses. The technology is there. So to try to be dealing with fuel poverty at the same time. I remember visiting a house when we were over in Germany, one of Hans's relatives, that literally was a kind of zero energy house. And it was just so depressing to think how much further ahead they are than us. So we need to be looking at housing, how it's structured, making it people-sized rather than just factories for stacking people in, and it will have to accelerate in the coming years. And I think that is recognised, but also that we need to do work on the housing stock that we have. To improve it, to insulate it, to make it more energy efficient. And I think there's a lot of recognition there. I don't know precisely what will be in the manifesto, but I think there is a recognition that we do need to accelerate the kind of housing that we're building.
Okay, yeah.
I'm sorry, just before we move on, yeah. Marshall, one of the other challenges we have is housing in rural areas. You know, I lived in Tobermory for a year when Hans was the GP there, and in the winter we had holiday cottages lying empty and families in caravans. You know, we need to tackle that. We need to tackle, you know, we hear a lot about the Airbnb issue in Edinburgh, but actually we have the same kind of issue in if you like, the holiday hotspots in Scotland. So part of the land reform has to actually be to bring land into housing usage in the very rural parts of Scotland and on the islands, because unless you can provide a home for a young person or a home for a family, we're not going to either keep young people in our rural areas or attract them back to our rural areas. So we really have a job of work to do there. Digital connectivity is part of it, but so is housing. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Following on from that, Heather Gibson is saying, I think much of the answer to the issues you have mentioned is about rebuilding society from the bottom up. Where there is little hope or opportunity in the eyes of the poorest in society, and poverty comes in many forms, rebuilding is needed to give an active purpose and place in a new Scotland.
Well, that's why, you know, when I talk about the kind of economic pyramid, I mean, after the crash, there were economists even at that time who were writing about the instead of doing the quantitative easing and handing it to the banks, which the UK government did to the tune of £435 billion, which they then, many of them paid each other in bonuses, despite having caused the crash. If you put that money into a more just social security system that actually provided social security, and if you put that into paying public sector workers well, you would be doing what I talked about earlier, is putting spending power into your local economy. If Scotland was independent, then every single person that the Scottish government give money to, whether as benefits, as, you know, basic salaries, universal basic income, or even high professional salaries like consultants or civil servants or whatever, that money would be getting spent in Scotland. And therefore you're not losing it. This narrative that has been used ever since Thatcher of, you know, an economy, a government's economy being like a household where you can only spend what is in the purse is nonsense. If you read Richard Murphy, he very much explains it's the other way around. You invest into your economy. You therefore make everyone actively engaged in that economy. The ability to get skills, the ability to work in it, the ability to get paid and to spend in it. And therefore every person is engaged in the economy and stimulating it and active in it. And therefore your economy starts to thrive. If what you have at the bottom is people who are all just surviving or living from food banks or you know, struggling and starving, then actually your economy is dying and your local economy is dying. So it might look good on the national books where you say, oh, we have reduced the national debt. But all you've done is shift that debt onto young people who have to pay £9,000 a year to go to university. You're shifting it onto people who are having to borrow money because they have to wait 5 weeks to get universal credit. You're shifting it onto people taking out loans or, you know, using the equity in their houses because they can't live on their pensions. All you're doing is dispersing that debt to individuals, and the private debt bubble in the UK is eye-watering and in danger of causing another financial crash. And as I said, what you're doing is therefore also taking that money out of your local economy in, in Ayrshire or in the southeast where you are. And that's the importance. Money that is invested by a government into its people is not wasted. It all returns back to that country's treasury. If you think about it, if you're well paid, if you're on a salary like I was as a consultant surgeon, 40% of my salary goes straight back to the government. Everything I buy, they take 20% of it. So in actual fact, the more I buy and spend, the more money the government are taking back off me all the time. So the more an economy is active, the more the government takes back ready to spend again. And our problem is it doesn't come back to us. It goes to Westminster. And that's the underlying problem is you need a circle, a virtuous circle in your economy. And the more you put at the bottom of that economy, the more people spend. If you're putting at the top through tax cuts and tricks around tax and tricks around inheritance tax, that's offshore in tax havens. That's not working in the economy at all.
Okay. Question from Ross. He's saying, I worry about the imposing of laws against peaceful protest. Rights are being slowly eroded, and Westminster seems quite happy to be bedfellows of countries with far-right tendencies. I have liked and loved the fact that SNP and Scotland on the whole are an outward friendly country. But how does that fit with the unionist element in this country that seems more right-wing?
I don't think it fits at all. I think that this is one of the other areas where we are completely diverging. So Brexit brought it into contrast when you saw that map the day after the referendum where Scotland was yellow and England was largely blue. And then if you looked at the snap election we had in 2019, you see the same thing in that kind of political voting way. But I think it also relates and is a result of the political philosophy. So people in England do seem to be happy enough to vote Tory, bizarrely, with the mess that is going on. They are still ahead of Labour in the polls. And they are very much this, xenophobic, anti-foreigner narrative is still there. You only had to listen to Priti Patel's plans around people who come here to seek refuge, to seek asylum, the cutting of international aid. I mean, they're not just halving the money going to Yemen, the most appalling situation in the world. In actual fact, they'd had to add extra money last year during the year. So in actual fact, the funding from the UK will be a third of what it was. So all of these projects across the world that have counted on UK funding that are being cut. I mean, leaving international aid at 0.7 was already going to mean a cut because the UK's GDP has fallen so much. Actually cutting it to 0.5 actively is an appalling act of vandalism. And then increasing nuclear warheads on the Clyde, 25 miles from our biggest city, by 40%. I mean, there's just no justification for it whatsoever. So unfortunately, England is going in that more controlling, anti-protest, right-wing direction. And that is not what Scotland wants. So Brexit brought it into focus, but it's much broader than Brexit. It's much deeper than Brexit. Brexit just is an example of the direction that is different between Scotland and England. So I think a lot of this kind of legislation is not something that people here want to see. So I don't think it fits at all. I mean, to me, we need a divorce. The relationship is over. I would like to see it being civilized. I would like to see it being friendly. There's no question but that an independent Scotland would be a close neighbour of England and Wales, that we would be working with colleagues in Ireland as well. Can we not get through this point of contempt and negativity and attack that is going on? And part of the problem is trying to get Boris Johnson and the Tories to accept Scotland is on a road to independence. Whenever it happens, Scotland is going in one direction. So surely it would be more civilized to accept it and to not have what we're seeing with Europe, that despite them cobbling together a very hard Brexit deal on Christmas Eve, the relationship between the two is just being trashed. It's being trashed even more now than during the transition period. So to me, we are hearing some senior Tories who are beginning to recognise or accept a referendum is inevitable, but Boris Johnson is not one of them. And this whole control, I mean, even that he came out today and talked about encouraging vaccine passports domestically here, that it could be up to a pub landlord to demand that people had vaccine or test certificates to get in. I accept that they may be necessary for international travel, but domestically, they're just going to create two-tier citizens and widen inequality. So, you know, they don't care about equality. In Scotland, I think we do.
Okay, and mindful of the time, I think we've got one final question, if that's okay with everyone. That's from Ian. The timing of the next India referendum is being based on something relating to the end of the epidemic. What will determine this end of epidemic definition?
Well, I think it'll be when we're not all stuck in our houses and we're not facing further surges. I mean, I would like to see it as quickly as possible. I had hoped that we would not have had this kind of second wave over the winter. On that basis, I would like to have seen it this September. I think that would have been a nice kind of symmetry, particularly when the only kind of phasing of independence referendums in legislation is in the Good Friday Agreement, and it's 7 years between independence referendums. So that would fit quite nicely with September 2021. I'm not sure that we will be in a position to guarantee that there would not be an upsurge then. So it may be that spring 22 is more likely. We are making progress with vaccination. That will make a difference, but we can't put all of our eggs in the vaccine basket. The potential to import variants like the South African variant, which are more vaccine resistant, could literally unwind a lot of the work that we've done. And if everyone just takes off on holiday again, like they did last summer, that's what sent us into the second wave, then we could see a surge in the autumn. And I think you don't want to risk that with if you were planning a referendum at that time. And the other thing is that, you know, the Kent variant was homegrown. That wasn't imported. That was created because Boris Johnson refused to follow the sage advice last September and delayed lockdown in England for 6 weeks and allowed London and the southeast to run at really hot levels. And the more COVID cases you have, the more it is spreading, the more mutations are happening. And eventually one of those mutations gives you a dangerous variant. The Kent variant is what is spreading rapidly through Europe at the moment. It already accounts for over 95% of all cases in the UK. So that wasn't imported, that was homegrown. They've already had a few of them that also have the South African mutation on them. And if we got that combination of the Kent variant, it's more infectious, it infects younger people, it infects children, it's more serious, it makes you iller, and it was vaccine resistant, then that would be catastrophic. And I don't think that Boris Johnson understands that as yet. So I think we're making progress. You can already see the drastic fall in hospitalizations and deaths in Scotland because we got into care homes really right from the start in December. I was on the media literally every other day in January and February being asked, why is Scotland's vaccine programme failing? Well, you look at the uptake in Scotland in care home staff, 99% of our care home staff vaccinated, in England 75%. We did the job and we're seeing it in lives saved in care homes. So that is all working, that all gives us a kind of light at the end of the tunnel. But literally, if we get too cocky, we could fall over and smash the whole thing. So I think September this year, sadly, I would think that was risking it. I would hope that we could be in a position by spring next year.
Okay, thanks very much, Philippa. I think that's, I think, a great range of questions we've had tonight. So thanks, Callum. We'd just like to have a few words as well. Callum?
No holding Callum back.
Thank you, Marshall. Do you know, 2014 was inspiring for so many of us. It did so much for our politics in Scotland. But one of the things that we can overlook is some of the people it brought to the fore. I mean, Philippa came from agreeing to speak at an event to becoming an internet sensation, to speaking and doing miles all across Scotland, to then standing for Parliament. And I have to tell you, you know, one of the great things about Philippa becoming an MP, I still remember her first day in the chamber as health spokesperson, when she stood up and chastised both the Tories and the Liberals, sorry, the Labour, who remembers the Liberals, for squabbling like bairns, and that her as a health professional watching it from home would be appalled. And from that day forward, it was hilarious. Anytime anyone spoke in a health debate, especially if they said anything remotely medical, they would have a wee look across to Philippa to check what they were saying was right. So Philippa, you know, I am so delighted you agreed to speak to us tonight and take so many questions. You are such a brilliant representative for us and for our movement. You've got a big brain, you've got a big heart, you're passionate and you're articulate. Thank you so much for spending time with us tonight. We're delighted to have you representing us, and we really appreciate, because we know how hard you're working at the moment, we really appreciate you coming on to speak to us tonight. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Callum, for your kind words. And I think I've really enjoyed this evening. It's been a great range of questions, and I hope that all of you have found something to chew over and think about and get yourselves geared up for these next few weeks. I think okay, take care, everybody.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Marshall.
Okay, thanks.